Former Special Counsel Jack Smith about the Trump Justice Department have just come to light. You'll hear some of them in a moment. Smith, as you may recall, indicted Mr. Trump in two cases, one alleging election interference, the other the classified documents kept at Mar-a-Lago. Since then, President Trump has called on Smith to face prosecution himself, alleging he led a personal vendetta against him, offering no proof. Well, now the New York Times has this headline: Jack Smith calls the Justice Department corrupted by Trump and his allies. In the report, they share clips from a private event last month, including this one.
Kevin McCarthy becomes Speaker of the
Department of Justice today, it targets people for criminal prosecution simply because the president doesn't like them. We have a department that fails to investigate cases because they might uncover facts that are inconvenient for narratives the president would like to press.
Welcome back to the channel. A federal court has dealt a major setback to FBI Director Kash Patel's controversial personnel plan, temporarily blocking efforts that critics argued would remove officials connected to investigations involving former President Donald Trump. According to the court's ruling, the judge found that the proposed actions raised serious concerns under federal civil service protections and could not move forward as presented. The decision halts additional dismissals while the legal challenge continues and orders remedies for employees the court determined may have been improperly removed. The ruling represents a significant obstacle for Patel, whose critics have accused him of attempting to reshape the FBI around political loyalty rather than long-standing institutional standards. Supporters, however, argue that leadership changes were necessary to reform what they view as a deeply flawed agency. At the center of the case is a detailed 69-page complaint that paints a troubling picture of internal decision-making within the Bureau. The filing alleges that personnel actions were influenced by political considerations and external pressures rather than established procedures. The complaint further claims that senior FBI leadership became increasingly responsive to political demands coming from outside the agency, including pressure from prominent voices within the broader MAGA movement and influential figures on social media. Attorneys representing the plaintiffs argue that these actions were not part of a legitimate restructuring effort, but rather an attempt to target officials based on their past involvement in politically sensitive investigations. The court has not yet ruled on every allegation contained in the lawsuit. However, the judge's decision to intervene at this stage signals that the claims were serious enough to warrant immediate judicial review. What makes this case particularly significant is that it goes beyond a dispute over personnel decisions. It raises broader questions about the independence of federal law enforcement, the limits of executive influence, and whether political considerations can play a role in decisions involving career government employees. The legal battle is far from over, but for now, the court's ruling represents a major setback for Patel's agenda and a significant victory for the officials challenging the dismissals. As more filings become public and additional hearings take place, the case is expected to provide a closer look at how decisions were made inside one of the country's most powerful law enforcement agencies, and if the allegations ultimately hold up in court, the implications could extend far beyond the FBI itself.
The New York Times says they reached out to the Justice Department for comment, and a spokesperson told them, quote, "I would expect nothing less from Jack Smith." Joining us now is former FBI Deputy Director Andrew McCabe, who's a senior law enforcement analyst. So were you surprised to hear Jack Smith's comments, or not surprised maybe by the comments, but the fact, I guess, that they leaked out about the DOJ, and how unusual is it for a former special counsel to speak candidly like this?
I think it's quite a departure from history. Special counsels usually wrap up their work, they publish a report, or they seek indictments, and then they ride off into the sunset. That's clearly not what's happening here. The fact that these comments have leaked out does not surprise me at all. I was actually at the comments that he made at George Mason University several months ago, and the same thing happened there. I think Jack Smith is a very smart guy and a great orator, if you've gotten to listen.
According to the lawsuit, the dismissals were unlawful. One of the most explosive allegations is that Patel reportedly told an official he was terminating that he understood the action was legally questionable, but felt he had no choice because his position depended on carrying it out. The complaint claims Patel said the FBI's previous investigations involving the president had not been forgotten and that pressure existed to remove certain officials connected to those matters. According to the filing, he suggested that his continued role depended on making those personnel changes. If the allegations are accurate, the lawsuit argues that Patel knowingly moved forward with actions despite concerns about their legality. Critics say that would represent a serious breach of the principles expected from the agency's highest-ranking law enforcement official. The plaintiffs contend that these decisions were not motivated by standard personnel considerations, but by a desire for political retaliation tied to past investigations. They argue that the actions reflected political pressure rather than independent law enforcement judgment. A federal court has now stepped in, finding enough concern with the allegations to halt further actions while the case proceeds. The officials bringing the lawsuit are not junior employees. According to the complaint, they include some of the most experienced and senior figures within the FBI. Among them is Brian Driscoll, who previously served as acting FBI director and held one of the Bureau's highest leadership positions.
These comments, you know that as well, and he knows what's going to happen when you speak in a private setting, but one in which people can take videos and photographs and everything else and spread them out. I think the important thing is that his message is getting out. I think it's vitally important to draw people's attention right now to the way that the institutions of justice in this country are being debased by this administration.
It is extraordinary. I mean, what we have seen at the FBI, at the Department of Justice, at the U.S. Attorney's Office. In this video, Smith also called the Justice Department corrupted. He did have a hopeful message. I just want to play this.
Now, given the way the department has been corrupted over the last year, I understand it's very easy to be cynical, to be skeptical about the future. There have been expressions of how terrible things.
We're talking about Brian Driscoll, former acting FBI director, along with Stephen Jensen and Spencer Evans, longtime FBI officials who spent years serving in federal law enforcement. According to the lawsuit, these were experienced career employees, not political appointees, brought in for partisan purposes. The complaint argues that their dismissals were not based on misconduct or poor performance. Instead, the plaintiffs claim they were targeted because of their connections to investigations involving Donald Trump. According to the lawsuit, that is the central issue at the heart of the case. The plaintiffs allege that Trump remained frustrated by the FBI investigations that took place during and after his time in office, and that those frustrations influenced personnel decisions after his return to power. The filing claims that Kash Patel was brought in with a mandate to reshape the Bureau and remove officials viewed as connected to those earlier investigations. Critics argue that it should not matter whether an investigation is politically sensitive if agents and officials are simply following evidence and carrying out their duties under the law. They contend that law enforcement agencies must remain independent and free from political retaliation. The lawsuit further alleges that personnel decisions were driven by political considerations rather than professional performance or conduct. If proven, the plaintiffs argue, such actions would represent a serious abuse of authority and a violation of the principles that are supposed to protect the independence of federal law enforcement. Perhaps the most significant allegation in the complaint is the claim that Patel himself recognized legal concerns surrounding the dismissals but proceeded anyway. That allegation is now likely to become one of the most closely examined issues as the case moves forward through the courts.
And where do we go from here? I believe the department ultimately will come through this better.
Do you believe that? Will come through it better? I mean, just the rebuilding that would be required, how easy is that going to be? Or depending on who follows?
Yeah, so Anderson, first of all, I share his optimism for the end state. I think we do get through this period. We, at some point, will get to a place in this country where we have better leadership at every level, and crucially at places like the Department of Justice and the FBI. My concern is when that when that opportunity arises, how long is it going to take us to repair the damage that's happened? It is not going to be a quick process. Will we get there? Yes, we will, but it's not going to be a year or a couple of years. It's going to be, we could be looking at decades. For instance, the Department of Justice.
According to the lawsuit, Patel allegedly made these remarks directly to some of the officials who were being dismissed. The complaint claims he told them that the president had not forgotten the Bureau's past actions and that significant pressure existed to carry out the personnel changes. The plaintiffs further allege that Patel indicated his own position could be affected if he failed to follow through with the dismissals. Despite concerns raised about the legality of the actions, the terminations reportedly proceeded. After reviewing the evidence presented at this stage of the case, the federal court concluded that the plaintiffs had shown sufficient grounds to challenge the dismissals under federal civil service protections. The judge found enough evidence of potential political motivation and retaliation to justify immediate court intervention while the case continues. As a result, the court issued a preliminary injunction blocking additional dismissals tied to the disputed policy. The ruling also ordered the reinstatement of affected officials and directed that lost compensation be restored while litigation proceeds. Beyond the individual firings, the decision raises broader questions about the legality of efforts to remove employees based primarily on their involvement in politically sensitive investigations. Critics argue that the ruling strikes at the core of the proposed FBI restructuring effort, suggesting that personnel decisions cannot legally be based on an employee's connection to lawful investigative work. One of the most striking aspects of the controversy is the contrast between past criticisms of the FBI and the allegations now being made in court. For years, Trump and many of his allies argued that the Bureau had been politically biased and had unfairly targeted him through investigations. They frequently claimed that federal law enforcement had been weaponized for political purposes. Now, opponents of the current leadership argue that the proposed personnel actions risk creating the very type of political influence over law enforcement that critics previously condemned. That debate is now moving from the political arena into the courtroom, where judges will ultimately decide whether the allegations are supported by the facts and the law.
Has basically lost what we call the presumption of regularity, the fact that federal judges basically accept department lawyers on their word. They respect the fact that the Justice Department comes into court and tells the truth, is transparent, reveals the information they have. Not so much anymore. We're seeing it around the country, judge after judge after judge. They're pushing back because they're tired of DOJ attorneys misrepresenting the facts, hiding information, ignoring court orders, those sorts of things. So the loss of that trust and integrity is going to take decades to rebuild in the federal bench. So it's going to be a long process, but I do think we'll get there eventually.
Critics argue that what is alleged in this lawsuit amounts to the very kind of political weaponization of law enforcement that many have warned about for years. The complaint claims officials were targeted because of their involvement in investigations connected to Donald Trump, turning personnel decisions into a form of political retaliation. According to the lawsuit, the evidence includes statements allegedly made by Patel himself regarding the reasons behind the dismissals. The plaintiffs argue those comments demonstrate both political motivation and awareness of potential legal problems. What makes this case significant is that it goes far beyond the fate of a handful of employees. The lawsuit presents a broader argument about the direction of federal law enforcement and whether political loyalty was allowed to influence decisions within the FBI. Spanning nearly 70 pages, the complaint lays out a detailed timeline of events, describing who was dismissed, why those actions were allegedly taken, and how the plaintiffs believe federal employment protections were violated. After reviewing the evidence presented at this stage, the court concluded that the plaintiffs had demonstrated a sufficient likelihood of success to justify a preliminary injunction. As a result, additional dismissals tied to the challenged policy have been blocked while the litigation continues. The case centers on 3 senior officials, Brian Driscoll, Stephen Jensen, and Spencer Evans. According to the lawsuit, none were removed for documented misconduct or performance failures. Instead, the plaintiffs contend that their association with investigations involving Trump was the primary reason they were targeted. The complaint further alleges that these dismissals occurred after weeks of public criticism and online attacks directed at officials connected to those investigations. Plaintiffs argue that this atmosphere created pressure that ultimately contributed to the personnel decisions. One of the most important allegations involves conversations that allegedly took place during the termination process. According to the lawsuit, Patel did not simply approve the dismissals, but also explained the reasoning behind them. The plaintiffs claim those explanations provide direct evidence of political motivation. The court has not yet made final findings on all of these allegations. However, the judge determined there was enough evidence to justify immediate intervention and preserve the status quo while the case proceeds through the legal system.